we're going to be looking at science from the perspective of two different competing worldviews, two really clashing worldviews, and these are the two worldviews that are really dominant in the West, and this is naturalism and theism. Naturalism claims that only the natural exists, and probably what's helpful to think about naturalism is more so anything what it eliminates. So under naturalism, only the natural exists, meaning there's no supernatural. There's nothing outside of nature, so no God. This is the broader worldview behind atheism. There's only the natural, no supernatural, there's no God, there's no angels and demons, there's no souls, etc. And this worldview is really well kind of encompassed by a very famous quote by Carl Sagan, who said, "The cosmos is all that is, or was, or ever will be." The natural universe, kind of like what we can observe broadly, is all that exists. There's nothing beyond that. That is in contrast to theism. And theism begins with the reality of God. It begins with the supernatural. And then that reality, it's really God who explains all other realities, like the natural world, the natural existence. And so theism is the broader worldview behind Christianity. If you're a Christian, you're a Christian theist. And one thing I want you to notice is that theism doesn't deny the reality of the natural world. It just says there's a reality that also transcends that. There's more to the picture. If you give just a naturalistic picture of the universe, of reality, that's incomplete. There's a reality that goes beyond that. When it comes to science, I think it's an interesting question, especially considering just how revered science is in our culture. Kind of just think kind of for yourself on your own experience, how science in our culture is really viewed as like the king of all disciplines. Like science reigns supreme. And so if you're in some sort of debate and you're trying to defend your point and you're like, well, it's science. That's like a conversation stopper right there. It's like, that's all you need. Oh, it's science. Oh, science? Science proclaimed its judgment. It's like, okay, well, that's end of story. Like, we don't need to think any further. It's just that settles the issue, trumps all other disciplines, all other concerns. And so science is just really revered. It's really very well respected in our culture. And so because of that, because of how science is sort of viewed in our culture, I think it's a really interesting question to ask. Well, how specifically does science relate to these two worldviews? And to many people, I'd say probably to most people, especially the naturalists, this is a very easy answer. Because especially to someone who holds to naturalism, the answer on how science relates to these things is obvious. There's a deep conflict between science and theism. There's this deep conflict between science and belief in God. And this has become known as the conflict thesis. And the conflict thesis is just that. It's just this general idea that science is at odds with belief in God. Science is at odds with religion. Science is at odds with Christianity. There's this conflict. And before we kind of flesh this out a little bit more, this is where I wanted you to just reflect a little bit about your own experience. Because what I want you to see is I want you to see just how ingrained this is in our culture. Just how mainstream it is. How people kind of just assume this. Maybe even certain Christians, from time to time, we assume this. Maybe not necessarily like this explicitly, but just this idea that there is some sort of conflict between science and religion, science and God. Because you might hear someone say something like this. You know, I'm not really into religion. I don't really need religion. I have science. And that just sounds like something that we could like very plausibly hear someone say. And that kind of statement makes sense to us. It makes sense to us, and we understand what it means. And what I want you to see is that assumes that there's some sort of conflict, that they're at odds. It's kind of one or the other. I'm not into religion, I'm into science. So it's kind of like you choose. Oh, well, you choose religion? Oh, well, I take science. And so I just want you to feel there's sort of this tension between the two. It's like one or the other, pick one. But even Christians, I think from time to time, we think like this. Why do we even care about what science has to say? I have faith. Right? Or I have the Bible. And once again, it's just maybe not this explicit, but it's this kind of built in, this almost assumed tension. Hey, pick one. And so this conflict thesis, even if people don't have the specific precision on how to express it, it's just ingrained in our culture. It's very mainstream. And so we want to flesh it out a little bit because there's kind of two different sides to this conflict, or kind of two different takes on it. One is that what we're learning from science, so as science progresses, as we learn more and more from science, what that is doing is it's making it less and less rational to believe in God. So as science advances, as we learn more from science, it's becoming less rational to believe in God. Effectively, science is showing that God doesn't exist. So that's one kind of way that this conflict takes. But the other is that theism is actually holding back science. So it's really this religious superstition. It's just like general religious belief that is keeping science from progressing to its full potential. And so those are kind of like just two different ways that this conflict thesis can play out. And the general support for this idea that there's this conflict between science and belief in God, almost it mirrors that. So there's two kind of main structures of support when it comes to defending this idea that there's this deep conflict, that science, religion, science, belief in God are at odds. The first is God of the gap type arguments. The idea here is that we use God to fill gaps in our knowledge. So for example, we might like look at the world out there and say, hey, there's something I don't understand. I don't really understand how all this works, and so because I don't understand it, I'm just going to say, well, God did it, right? And so we're using God to kind of fill these gaps in our knowledge. And the idea behind this kind of way of arguing is that as science progresses, it's really rapidly filling these gaps. It's really like rapidly closing these gaps. And because of that, our need for God as an explanation is really being eliminated. And it's being eliminated by science. And so we can just think of like numerous examples of this, and people point to numerous examples of this throughout history, because if you look historically, there was a time when we used God or gods to basically explain like all the workings of the universe. So how do I explain the sun moving across the sky? Well, there's a sun god. Or the volatility in the ocean, that's probably the mood of some sort of sea god. Or birth and conception, those can be accounted for by fertility gods. Crop cycles were the product of various agricultural gods, and so on. And we could keep listing examples like that. Now, today, of course, we don't believe in any of those things, right? We don't need those gods. We don't need those types of explanations. Well, why don't we know those types of explanations? Well, of course, because we have science, and now we know better. So we don't need any sun god because science has explained it. Not only is like the sun's not moving across the sky, the earth is rotating, right? And we can explain the earth's rotation. We can explain like all the planetary motion in our solar systems through science and different concepts like gravity and so forth. And we understand, because of science, how environmental systems work. We understand how reproductive systems work. So we don't feel any pressure to posit, agricultural gods or sea gods or fertility gods. And then when you look kind of just throughout history, this is the consistent pattern of science. It can now explain what we used to need God or gods to explain. And today there may be more sophisticated gaps, like the origin of life, the beginning of universe, emergence of consciousness, all of these kind of things. But there's no real reason, just kind of given this pattern, given this history of science, to think that science won't, if it hasn't already, be able to like explain those things as well, right? Because that's just kind of what science does. And so this is the idea that science, it's filling these gaps in our knowledge that we used to need God to explain. And so now we just don't have really any need of just belief in God in the first place. That's one kind of area of support for this conflict thesis. The second is more historical. This is the idea that just when you look at the history of science, when you look at the history of religion, what you see is just science and religion, science and theism just constantly at war. And it's really like, just look at all the examples of how religion has stifled science or held it back. I think probably the best example of this, or a good example of this, is Galileo. Back in Galileo's time, the Roman Catholic Church was dominated by this Aristotelian way of thinking. And this is like very oversimplified, but in Aristotle's way of thinking, the heavens, so what we would think of as outer space, was all perfection. So all that out there is perfection. And according to him, perfect motion was always circular. So given that the heavens were perfection, perfect motion was circular, it must mean that like the moon, the stars, all the heavenly bodies were moving in these perfect circles. Now what Galileo did was Galileo took a telescope, he looked out at the universe, he looked out at the outer space, and what he saw, what he observed, was that Aristotle's way of thinking was deeply flawed. And he began to express those flaws. But this was very problematic because the Aristotelian way of thinking was church orthodoxy. And so now he's going against church orthodoxy. And so what the Roman Catholic Church did was they silenced Galileo. And then really it was centuries after that, they just kept fighting these ideas that he was positing. And now looking back with hindsight, what we know is that Galileo got it right. And so the natural thinking, the natural question, and I think the logical question is just, well, how much more scientific progress could we have made had it not been for the church standing in the way, holding it back? And this is just the general sentiment, I think, of a lot of people, right? Because we can list more examples of this, more examples of when like the church held back scientific progress. And nowadays we can see that this task or this kind of like holding back scientific progress, it's not just like an unfortunate reality. It's like, this is really dangerous. To halt the progress of science is really dangerous. Just think for yourself of like how much medical advancements have been brought to us, how much just like technological advancements have been brought to us just from understanding the world around us. Like we're actually experiencing that right now, right, with COVID. Think of how fortunate we are because of the developments of science that we can understand like how the human body works, how viruses work, ways to treat it, how we can come up with vaccines like that. And that's all like thanks to science. And so just given all of this, just the natural question is, how much better would this world be if we didn't have religion, if we didn't have kind of belief in God holding back this scientific progress? And the conclusion of most people and what history kind of seems to show is that, man, if we could only like just break the bonds of religion, science, and therefore humanity could just flourish the way it's capable of flourishing. And so this is kind of like the two main pillars of defense for this conflict thesis. This idea just that science and belief in God, science and religion, these things are, there's a deep conflict. They're at odds with one another. And given just that, I think this is way more ingrained within our culture and just our way of thinking than we may even just generally think, it's going to be real important to evaluate this. And one reason that I want to evaluate it and look at it is because although all of this kind of like logic and this reasoning sounds really good, the conflict thesis is false. And so in order to kind of show you why it's false, let's just break down and look specifically like at those two pillars of support. So this is why the conflict thesis is mistaken. First, let's take the God of the gaps type reasoning. This idea that science is just providing us with information to the point that it's just there's no need for belief in God. This way of thinking is just like it's fundamentally confused. It's really bad logic. And the reason why I say that, kind of the main reason primarily why this is bad logic, it has to do with different types of explanations. There's different levels of explanations, and we need to understand that to understand why this reasoning doesn't work. And to help you understand, or to kind of get at the point that I'm making, I'm going to share or read from you a thought experiment. And this thought experiment is by a Christian thinker named John Lennox. And this will help us just kind of illustrate just this difference and kind of almost like different levels of explanation. So Lennox says this. He says, take a Ford motor car. It is conceivable that someone from a remote part of the world who was seeing one for the first time and who knew nothing about modern engineering might imagine that there is a God, Mr. Ford, inside the engine making it go. He might further imagine that when the engine ran sweetly, it was because Mr. Ford inside the engine liked him, and when it refused to go, it was because Mr. Ford didn't like him. Of course, if he were subsequently to study engineering and take the engine to pieces, he would discover that there is no Mr. Ford inside it. Neither would it take much intelligence for him to see that he did not need to introduce Mr. Ford as an explanation for its working. His grasp of the impersonal principles of internal combustion would be altogether enough to explain how the engine works. So far, so good. But if he then decided that his understanding of the principles of how the engine works made it impossible to believe in the existence of a Mr. Ford who designed the engine in the first place, this would be patently false. In philosophical terminology, he would be committing a category mistake. Had there never been a Mr. Ford to design the mechanisms, none would exist for him to understand. And so what he's fleshing out, I think, is a really important principle. He's kind of pointing out, in the same way that this is flawed thinking here when it comes to the workings of the universe, this idea that maybe just because we understand, when it comes to the workings of an engine, just because we understand everything about like how the engine works, that because of that we somehow eliminated the need for Mr. Ford or the cause of the engine in the first place. No, of course that doesn't work. But it's also equally flawed when it comes to the workings of the universe. Just because we understand the mechanics of the universe does absolutely nothing to undermine the potential need for things like a creator or a designer or a cause of those systems in the first place. And the reason for it is because these are just different types of explanations. The first type of explanation, or the former, are scientific questions. The latter are philosophical questions. These are fundamentally different things. And I want you to grasp this. Science's ability to explain things within the universe will never have any effect on belief in God, because God and science are explaining radically different things. And this is why I call this type of logic, and the type of logic that people are forwarding here, because you hear this reasoning all the time. This is why I call it fundamentally confused. Because it's fundamentally confused about the explanatory power of God's existence, so what God is even being used to explain, but it's also fundamentally confused on like the scope and limits of science itself, which is a whole like topic probably for next month. But the point really being is that there are certain gaps within our knowledge that science is not even in principle capable of explaining. And when it comes to most of those gaps, many of the times the most reasonable explanation in those instances is that there is a personal creator. And that's something that we've defended extensively here, like specific instances of that. But I just want you to see just how confused this type of logic is. It's confused on the very level of explanation. But not only that, the historical kind of defense of this conflict thesis is also confused. That like we look out and we look at kind of the history of the church and science, and what we see is just that these two have been constantly at war. And what Christianity, what the church has been doing is just halting scientific progress. That kind of idea is just patently false. And I just want to be very clear of what I'm not saying. Have throughout history there been times when the church has held back science? Yeah, way too many of them. And it's tragic. But if that's like all you're focusing on, if you think that like encompasses all of like scientific and Christian history, you're just looking at one side of the coin, and a very honestly a very misleading side of the coin, because there's a whole other like different aspect to history and to the reality of the development of science that we need to look at. So it's actually really difficult to look at the history of science, and what I'm talking about is especially like key periods of science's like emergence or development. It's hard to look at those periods and these kind of key periods in scientific development and conclude anything other than not only did belief in God not hinder science, but it was actually theistic belief specifically that gave rise to science. And one thing that you just need to first notice is that just look at all or most of the towering figures in the emergence of science in the first place. Almost all of them were theists. They believe in God. In fact, many of them were Christians. Now, how a naturalist will push back to that fact is because it's really hard to deny that when you look at like the emergence of science, that the key founders, like the father figures of science, so to speak, that they were Christian or that they were theist. But what a naturalist will say is that that fact that they believed in God it's almost irrelevant, or it's just kind of coincidence, because most people back then believed in God, and it's like it's no more relevant than maybe the fact that most of them had beards, or something like that. And so basically, the way they would argue is that just because when you look at this group of people who we'll just call them the founders of science, it's a little bit oversimplified, but just because they believed in God, just because you can kind of like pick out some feature that they all hold in common, doesn't mean that you can like credit that feature in any way for what emerged out of it. But this way of thinking just misses the whole point, because the key point isn't just that they believed in God. It's that it was that belief in God that was often their main inspiration for doing science in the first place. It wasn't just that they had this irrelevant belief. It was specifically that belief that motivated them to do and begin the scientific enterprise, and they were very outspoken about it. So I'm going to list just three kind of theistic beliefs that these founders of science were motivated by, that kind of gave rise to the whole scientific enterprise. And the first was the belief that God had free will. So in their belief, there was a creator behind the universe, and he was free. Why this is significant is because they didn't view God as kind of like, there was nothing restricting him. When he created, he was free to create any universe that he wanted, any natural world that he wanted. There were many different ways that he could have created nature and all of that. And so what that meant was that you couldn't just like purely reason to what the natural world is like. And that was kind of like the methodology in the past. So, Aristotle kind of, just reasoning about like the universe is perfection works like this. And so he's kind of just like purely reasoning or speculating what everything is like. But according to the kind of like founders of science, no, God has free will. So he could have created the universe in many different possible ways. And so the only real way to find out what the universe is actually like, what the world is actually like, what kind of world God actually created, there's no alternative than going out there and looking. Right? You have to go out there and observe what God decided to create. And so it was specifically this theistic belief that like drove people out into the world to observe it in the first place, which just is science, right? Rather than just like reason and speculate about it. The second theistic belief that led to the rise of science was the belief in the uniformity of nature. So at the heart of all like scientific inquiry is the conviction that the universe is orderly, that there's this like consistency to nature. It's ordered in a certain way, so that we can find patterns, we can make predictions, we can discover what it's really like. There are common trends. The question becomes, where does this conviction come from? Where does this conviction come from that the world out there is actually orderly, that there's patterns, that there's a consistency to it? Well, for these men, it was obvious. It came from the belief that there was a rational creator behind the universe who imposed order on it, and he also was capable of sustaining it. Related to that is the conviction and the belief that there are rational minds in the universe. So this was the belief that not only did God create like an orderly, intelligible universe, but he also created in us a rational mind that was capable of understanding that order, of actually discovering that order. And so Galileo says this. He says that God endowed us with senses, reason, and intellect. And this motivated him to do science because it was his belief that God giving him that intellect, giving us that intellect, was was evidence of his intention that he wanted us to go use that intellect to go discover things about the world around us. And so it was these, and this is what I want you to get, it was these three distinctly theistic beliefs that led the scientific founders to even pursue science in the first place. And so we can actually ask a really interesting question. And the question is, would there even be a thing called science if it wasn't for religious belief or belief in God? That's the total opposite of the conflict thesis. And this is an interesting question, but obviously one that's very also controversial and disputed. So I'm not going to get into it. But what I will say, and what I find kind of hard to dispute, is that science certainly wouldn't have developed and flourished in the way that we've seen it flourish and developed today without this belief, because just the very motivation to do science in the first place wouldn't have been present. Given that, I think the support for this conflict thesis, this idea that there's this deep conflict between science and belief in God, is seriously mistaken. It's flawed. There is no conflict here. But rather than kind of just like end here, I want to actually raise a different conflict thesis in its place. And we can call this the true conflict. And this is the idea that not only is there not a conflict between science and theism, they're complementary, which kind of just defended, but there actually is a real conflict. But that conflict isn't between science and God. That conflict is between science and naturalism. And the argument for this is essentially that theism provides a foundation for science that naturalism can't. Theism provides a foundation for science that naturalism can't. And one thing that we probably all recognize to certain degrees is something is only as good as its foundation. Probably the easiest way to see this is like in engineering. So if I went up to an engineer and was all proud of myself, I was like, hey, I built a really good bridge. Don't mean to brag, but I built an incredible bridge. There's only one like little problem with this bridge. But it's a little problem. It's that the foundation it's standing on can't actually support it. Now, if I said that to an engineer, I'd probably get a very puzzled look, right? He'd probably think I'm pretty stupid, and would probably be right. Because what we know is that a structure, a bridge, is only as good as the foundation that it's standing on. In that scenario, I didn't build a good bridge, I built a collapsed bridge. And the same thing actually holds true for knowledge disciplines like science. All knowledge disciplines rest on certain presuppositions. By that, I mean just like certain underlying assumptions that are necessary for that discipline to even operate in the first place. And these kind of serve as the foundation for that knowledge discipline. And if you can't support the presuppositions, you can't support the discipline itself. And so what I want to do is I want to evaluate two presuppositions of science. And by the way, there are many more than this. But I specifically want to look at the two presuppositions of science that were the ones that motivated these early scientists in the first place. That's the uniformity of nature and rational minds. And the argument that I'm basically going to be making is that these presuppositions only make sense in a theistic worldview. Naturalism can't account for these things, and because of that, naturalism actually undermines the very enterprise of science itself. So first, the uniformity of nature. As we've kind of already talked about a little bit, science presupposes order. When we go out and look at the world and when we do science, what we find is that there's an incredible amount of uniformity in nature. And this uniformity to nature is necessary for science to even operate in the first place. So there's this consistency to the way that the world works. And we recognize this as certain laws of nature. And it's because of these laws of nature that we're actually able to find patterns in the workings of the world, and we're able to make conclusions about the natural world. And one thing that's important is that these laws, they stay stable, meaning they stay the same, like they remain the same throughout time. And this is very important because this means that we don't have to worry about just gravity all of a sudden ceasing, or like water just all of a sudden becoming flammable. And this consistency, this stability to the laws of nature is vital to making future predictions about things. And this is like a vital aspect of science, meaning like you just need to believe that things will operate by the same laws in the future that they operate today. So there's amazing like uniformity and consistency to nature. Naturalism can't account for this. So the fact of this order, the fact of this stability, the fact that really when we look out in the world, there's just this incredible like mathematical precision to it, is something that naturalism can't and probably will never be able to explain. On naturalism, it's kind of just inexplicable. You can't really explain it. You can't really account for it. At best, we can say it's just kind of like a stroke of luck, that the universe is ordered and it has this consistency that we find it. But naturalism also can't give us any reasons for expecting that like orderliness and that consistency going forward, because there's nothing sustaining these things. And I think you can actually go beyond that. That really, if the naturalistic picture of reality is correct, what you should expect to find is actually, if the naturalistic picture of reality is correct, what you should actually expect to find out there in nature is chaos, not order. Why do I say this? Like, let's just remember that the naturalistic picture of reality just is that there's no intention behind any of it. It just is that there's no design behind any of it. Everything is just kind of like the product of these like blind, unguided processes. And so this is why Albert Einstein said this. He was writing a letter and he says, "You find it strange that I consider the comprehensibility of the world as a miracle or an eternal mystery? Well, a priori, meaning just before you actually go out there and look and see different, one should expect a chaotic world, which cannot be grasped by the mind in any way. The success of such a project presupposes a high degree of ordering of the objective world, and this could not be expected a priori." That is the miracle, which is being constantly reinforced as our knowledge expands. There's no naturalistic way to account for this beautiful uniformity in nature that's necessary for science to operate in the first place. On the other hand, theism can account for this very well. So the fact that the like intelligibility, the mathematical precision, exactitude of the universe, this makes a lot of sense as the artifact of a perfect mind. And if God himself is a rational being, then it stands to reason that he would create a rational, orderly universe, and that he's also capable of sustaining it as such. And so when it comes to these things like the order, the consistency of the laws of nature, the mathematical precision of the natural world, all of these, and this is what's key, all of these things which underlie science, they're necessary for science to even operate. Theism can account for these and justify these things in a way that naturalism just can't. A creator, a designer can guarantee realities like this, whereas under naturalism, at best, we can just call this a fortunate accident. Second, and I think this is perhaps even more devastating to naturalism, is that science presupposes a rational mind. If we think about it, it's not really enough just to have an orderly, comprehensible universe. In addition to that, science actually presupposes that there are minds equipped and capable of understanding that universe. Meaning that in order for science to operate, there needs to be human minds that are equipped, that are like have the capacity to understand those principles of nature, to understand how the world works. This is something that naturalism can't account for. And it's like, we just need to think about it. Like, just think of the whole naturalistic picture. On this picture of reality, human intelligence owes its like ultimate origin to just mindless matter. That's all there really is. And this raises some like really serious challenges. Just thinking about it logically, the idea that rational mind emerged from mindless matter by way of undirected mindless processes, that's really hard to grasp. That's really tough to grasp how we could even like rationalize that. And this type of problem have been fleshed out in like many different ways. So there's a lot of people who've kind of like exposed this error in the naturalistic worldview, but I want to kind of focus on one way that it's been kind of fleshed out. And this is an argument by Alvin Plantinga. And all you need to know about Alvin Plantinga is he's an absolute beast. So Alvin Plantinga is my boy. He's arguably the greatest living Christian philosopher. And he forwarded an argument called the evolutionary argument against naturalism. And that's what I'm going to try to explain. Just as a little like preface, this is by far like the most complex and the toughest kind of content that I'm bringing up tonight. So just try your best to hang in there. I'm going to try my best to explain it. The argument goes like this. It's that under naturalism, human beings are solely the product of this undirected, unplanned Darwinian process. So human beings are solely accounted for by this Darwinian evolutionary process. And one thing that we know about Darwinian evolution is that it's geared towards survival. It's geared towards survival, meaning like natural selection takes place. Natural selection selects based on kind of like random changes in certain species. And then it's the fittest that survive. So it's those survivors that their characteristics kind of continue going forward. So what naturalism is selected, like it helps us survive, and it's the survivors whose characteristics kind of get promoted going forward. Now on this picture, our cognitive faculties, meaning our reasoning ability, our perceptions, our memories, just kind of these abilities that produce beliefs in us, these also are evolved in a way to promote survival. Meaning our cognitive faculties evolved in a way that promotes or kind of aims at survival. It aims at reproduction. Meaning our cognitive faculties, the aim of them is not truth. The aim of them is not reality, understanding reality. It's producing whatever beliefs help you survive. And what this does is this creates a certain tension, because those are two very different things, whether our cognitive faculties are aimed at survival or aimed at truth. And now you might be tempted to say, well, maybe understanding reality, so attaining truth, is the best means for survival. So these kind of two things go hand in hand. So you may be tempted to say, well, okay, maybe our cognitive faculties, they're aimed at survival, but understanding reality is the best way to survive. So the two things can go together. Our cognitive faculties can both produce truth about the world around us and help us survive. The problem is that this just is not necessarily the case. So there's really no good reason to believe that like an aptitude for truth is the only or even an especially likely mechanism for producing survival enhanced behavior. Just track with me. Thinkers recognize this. So Eric Baum says this. He says, sometimes you're more likely to survive and propagate if you believe a falsehood than if you believe the truth. Steven Pinker, who's an evolutionary psychologist, he says, our brains were shaped for fitness, not for truth. Sometimes the truth is adaptive, but sometimes it's not. So let me give you an example of this. One thing that us human beings generally believe, we see this in culture, our culture, we see this in other cultures, and it's a very good thing. We've generally come to believe that when it comes to our fellow human beings, the people sitting around you, our fellow human beings have a certain sense of dignity. They have a certain intrinsic worth. It's just built into us. And because of that, and because we have a sort of moral obligation to one another, that we should respect and we should honor that dignity in one another. Now, this idea that there's kind of intrinsic human dignity and that we have a moral obligation to that under naturalism is clearly false, but also it clearly helps our species survive. So coming to this belief that there's this like intrinsic dignity in one another has really helped our species survive. It's really helped us propagate and move forward. But the point is, there is this gap between what's actually true and what actually promotes survival. They're not necessarily the same thing. So survival, the truth is no guarantee of survival value. And the problem is just this. If when it comes to our cognitive faculties, survival is the standard, if that's what the aim and whatever this thing is producing beliefs in me is geared at survival, well, it's impossible. There's really no way to know if those ideas that I have are actually true or if they're just adaptive yet false. Given that our cognitive faculties, they're produced in such a way to give me beliefs that promote survival, and there is this gap, just because something is true doesn't necessarily mean it helps you survive. Sometimes falsehoods help you survive. There's actually no way to know if any of my given beliefs are actually true or if they're just adaptive yet false. And so what naturalism actually does is naturalism undermines our cognitive faculties. It undermines our very ability to produce knowledge of the world around us. Yet it's specifically those faculties, it's specifically those abilities that are necessary to do science in the first place. And this leads to like what is just such a fascinating yet an ironic picture. Because the whole conflict thesis, the whole basis of that is that science is pushing us away from belief in God. Science is pointing us to naturalism. But if naturalism is actually true, science itself is undermined, so it can't point us anywhere. So there's this massive epistemic flaw in naturalism. And it just is incapable of accounting for our rationality, which is necessary to do science. In fact, it undermines it. On the other hand, theism can make sense of this. Theism can make sense of our rational capacities and just abilities really easily and naturally. One way to think of it is this, a question. Where could our rational capacity have come from if not from another mind? And if God himself is a rational being, if God himself created the universe in an intelligible and orderly way, it really naturally follows that he would give us the proper faculties to understand that order and that reality. So this presupposition makes perfect sense within theism. I want to close with this by kind of just summarizing and making two different claims. So based on everything that we talked about, kind of like looking at these different presuppositions of science and what can support them and what can't, I want to just basically summarize and kind of just bring these points home for you in the form of two different claims. So I'm going to make two different claims. One's a weaker claim and one's a stronger claim to just like tie everything that we've been talking about together. The weaker claim is this: at the very least, when it comes to science, and specifically when it comes to the presuppositions that are necessary for science to operate in the first place, these presuppositions fit better within a theistic worldview than a naturalistic one. If you begin with, in the beginning, God, we have a reasonable explanation or expectation for the assumptions of an intelligible universe, of the existence of rational minds. But if you begin with, in the beginning, particles, or in the beginning strings, or in the beginning plasma, or whatever, it's hard to see how these assumptions could have ever obtained. And so this is why, by the way, that it's absolutely no coincidence that science emerged out of Christianity. But second, and this is a much stronger claim, God's existence is a necessary condition for science to operate in the first place. God's existence is a necessary condition for science to even operate in the first place. And if this holds true, which I think it does, it would lead naturalism and science to be at very deep odds, which just definitely by looking at it looks to be the case.